Okay, sorry I got cut off there. Working from home continues to be an experiment. So we were looking at these multi-sector modeling of GDP impacts, and just to add some caveats, these models remain limited. Oops, let me get the pointer up. These models, you hear the nice sound of the monsoon. Mumbai is getting its glorious monsoon, pouring rain for days, sometimes weeks, but I love it. So these models remain limited and cannot capture all relevant mechanisms. In particular, they lack an explicit representation of network-shaped industries such as electricity, water, and transport. So you can read this paper to see why that is, but the paper provides an estimate and methodologies to assess the consequences of disruptions in networked infrastructure, including electricity, water, and sanitation and transportation, and find that the indirect losses linked to infrastructure disruptions can be significant. You can think of transportation, electricity, water supply, etc. Even if the disaster happens in one place and may be very localized geographically, the supplies that are going through the network to many other regions can get perturbed for short or long periods depending on the disaster and reconstruction and recovery. So that's what this is talking about. The models described here also underestimate economic impacts due to their aggregation level, representing economic sectors, that is, thousands of businesses located in different places as unique producers may get put together, averaging out many of the details. Such a framework assumes that all businesses from one sector suffer the same direct impact from disasters. This is obviously not the case. In other words, that impacts are homogeneously distributed among the businesses from each sector. So steel producers, for example, or car dealers, or at various levels, these can be aggregated. Considering the multiplicity of producing units, their locations and explicit supply chains would allow for a much more realistic representation of natural disaster consequences. So the models have to include these sorts of details. Modeling exercises suggest this approach would lead to higher estimates of disaster output losses, not least because they would take into account indirect impacts on locations that are not directly hit by the disaster. Firm level studies also suggest that there is a strong breeze because I left the cross breeze on. Let me continue. Firm level studies also suggest that vulnerability of firms can vary significantly depending on their position in the supply chain. Overall, modeling supply chains and their role in propagating shocks can be complex and data intensive. However, even if simplifying assumptions need to be made, acknowledging and quantifying their roles can be crucial to understanding the true economic cost of climate shocks. I will go ahead and close. Sorry about that. I had to close the door because the breeze was too strong. Moving forward, what are the sample targets and indicators in terms of taking action? Percentage of explicit and implicit contingent liabilities. Oops, I need to go into display mode. So sample targets and indicators: percentage of explicit and implicit contingent liabilities covered by reserve funds, contingent credit lines, pointer there, insurance products or similar instruments, disaster escape clause in budget processes approved, process for managing inflow of international aid in place in case of major disasters, including using existing financial instruments to coordinate delivery to the sites of disaster where funds are needed, and trust governance. Trust is needed to see that corruption is not seen to be a big factor for international aid. Post-disaster public financial management and engagement framework. There was a review conducted and approved so that you are prepared for the financial and macro fiscal issues. So PDPFM principles and processes approved, that is the public financial management post-disaster. The resources, the resources mobilization challenge in a post-disaster situation therefore requires specific financial solutions which need to be arranged in advance to be readily available when disaster hits, which we'll see in a figure in a minute. These financial solutions must obey 4 core principles. Timeliness of funding. Some funds are necessary right away, but not all resources are needed at once. Appropriate delivery mechanisms are important. How funds are dispersed and how they reach beneficiaries is as important as where the money comes from. Disaster risk layering. No single financial instrument can address all risks. That has to be thought of based on data and analytics as described in toolbox G and H that we already talked about in terms of modeling these things. It's important to quantify risk to build a sound risk financing strategy, okay, especially considering risk is now very non-stationary and climate change will keep on increasing risks in some places and maybe decreasing risks in other places. Operational disaster risk financing and insurance framework, core technical steps that we want to think about. So here is the pre-disaster and post-disaster steps. So you are going this direction and that direction. So assess risks, arrange financial solutions, deliver funds to beneficiaries, and reduce underlying risks. What each one comes with: sustainable financial protection requires reducing underlying drivers of this risk. It complements risk reduction by managing residual risk which is not feasible or not cost effective to mitigate. So you do everything you can and leave some acceptable residual risk behind. It also creates incentives to invest in risk reduction and prevention by putting a price on risk and clarifying risk ownership. Okay, here under pre-disaster assessing risk section, risk assessments for financial protection quantify potential disaster impacts based on historical and simulated data which we have discussed through the toolboxes. This often requires investments in the necessary underlying hazard, exposure and vulnerability data. Response can be added to this when the model gets updated. It also includes building an effective interface between the policy makers and underlying technical models. So technical jargon has to be translated to decision makers so that actual decisions are made. Under arranging financial solutions, effective post-disaster response and recovery rely on access to sufficient and timely resources. This includes arranging the required financial resources for the government to meet its contingent liabilities, developing catastrophe risk and agricultural insurance markets, building on public-private partnerships, developing rules and arranging financing instruments for scalable social protection. Under delivering funds to beneficiaries, resources should reach beneficiaries in a timely, transparent and accountable fashion. This requires effective administrative and legal systems for the appropriation and execution of funds for the government budget, insurance distribution and settlement, often through private channels, as well as social protection programs. Okay, so maybe this is long enough. Let me come back and conclude the rest of this. Actually this is a long section, so it'll take a bit more, so maybe a few more podcasts, but nonetheless we'll come back and do that. This is a bit short, but that's okay.